We are in Hebrews chapter 11. We're going to be dealing with verses 23 through 29. And once again, we're going to be dealing with a continuation of the story of the heroes of the faith, as the author of the book of Hebrews sees. Now, one of the things that's really interesting you'll see about the book of Hebrews and about this kind of listing of the heroes of the faith is a whole lot of ground in the Old Testament is being covered in a very short period of time. I mean, we're looking at, 7 verses on Moses. And there's a whole lot more in Exodus than 7 verses talking about Moses. So it's one of those things where you're going to be sitting there going, okay, what is this author focusing on? What's his point? What's this all about? Because he's skipping over the whole story. We saw him do it with Abel. We saw him do it with Enoch. We saw him do it with Noah. We've seen him do it with Abraham. You see this kind of a very quick rendition getting to a very particular point. And that very particular point is the same throughout kind of this narrative, which is what is really important here. It is where these people end up. It is all about a faith that is described in verse 1 of chapter 11 as simply this. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. I mean, it is super easy. And we'll see a couple of examples as we move along here. It's super easy for us to do our natural thing, the thing that we love to do. I want to know what the end of the story is going to be. I've already told you that I'm one of those kind of guys that if I'm watching a streamed series, I have a real tendency to go on YouTube and look for the season finale recap. And then I know what's going to happen to everybody, and I don't get angry along the way. Well, that person's getting picked on. That's unfair, because I know that they're going to win in the end. And so it's okay. That's not the way God works, and that's not the way our faith is supposed to work. We are to have a faith that must rest on a fervent belief in the promises of God and the unwavering faith in the fact that Jesus is who he says he is and does what he says he's going to do, and that the only way to enter into eternity in a good way is through a relationship with Jesus Christ. And we've got to know that. We've got to believe that. It's got to be what we're all about. We have to have the kind of faith that is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction. And when they say conviction, they're talking about certainty of the things not seen. He skimmed over, the preacher, and again, I made the point a number of times that I believe, and when we get there, I'll point you to language that leads me to believe that what this is a sermon. This is not a letter per se, at least as I see it. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. And you know what? It really doesn't matter. It could be a letter. It could be a sermon. I think it's a sermon, but I don't think that's ultimately the controlling thing. The controlling thing here is that this is a message to a group of people who are Jews. They are Hebrews. I think that's why the book's called Hebrews. They're a group of people. They're Hebrews. They have come to a faith in Jesus Christ. And they're facing persecution from the Romans and from their fellow Jews. They're getting it from all sides. And he wants them to understand that the point of it all is that they have to persevere until the end. They have to make it. They have to get across the finish line. And there's only one way that they're going to get across the finish line. And there's only one way we're going to get across the finish line. And that's through faith. And it has to be a faith that believes, regardless of whether we see it or not. We have to have a faith that trusts in God's word and believes in the promises of God above all else. He skims over the stories of these guys, not just to get to what's important, but because of exactly who he's talking to. He's talking to Jewish people that have gone probably to their version of Hebrew school. The stories of the people that he is talking about in chapter 11, they are intimately familiar with. They know who all of these people are. They know what it's all about. So it is not something that is surprising to them. He's focusing in on a very specific thing. And now we come to Moses. So let's look at our text starting in verse 23, and we'll go through verse 29. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful. That word beautiful really probably better translated as some form of special. They saw something different about him. And they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. In terms of the heroes of the Old Testament, Moses is kind of the crescendo, as the Jewish people see it in any event. The book of Deuteronomy ends with kind of an epitaph for Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 10 through 12. And there has not arisen a prophet since Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants, and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great deeds of terror that Moses did in the sight of Israel. So for the Jews, Moses is at the top of the heap. Moses was Israel's greatest prophet, their greatest lawgiver. He was the greatest historian. After all, he is the author of Genesis through the majority of Deuteronomy. And despite all this, he was described in Numbers 12:3 as, now the man Moses was very meek, and by that they mean humble, more than all people who were on the face of the earth. Think about that kind of humility in the face of everything that he was exposed to and everything that was accomplished. And you have to think that that's really pretty incredible. Because I'd like you to point me to anyone in our world today, in our current culture, who would have the kind of success or influence or connection with God or whatever that Moses has had that would maintain that kind of humility. It's really something that's incredible when you think about it. It really should take our breath away. And as the book of Exodus shows us, he is the deliverer of the nation of Israel. And that Moses' deliverance of Israel is an act of incredible faith in and of itself. It's an example of Hebrews 11:1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And it is the faith in the deliverance of Israel that is the preacher author's focus in verses 23 through 29. It is a faith that delivers those around us and sets them free. And it is a faith that will be at odds with the culture we face. Moses' faith is explored in 5 short sections, each one beginning with the phrase, by faith, beginning with verse 23. I want you to pay attention as we look at verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Whose faith are we talking about? Yeah. I mean, it's easy to say by faith Moses, but the reality is what we're talking about is the faith of his parents. Now, one of the Roman historians, Josephus, makes a big deal about the fact that he believes that Amram, Moses' father, was given a specific vision that he was going to have a child, a son, who was going to be the deliverer of the people of Israel. And that's why, because you have to remember, this is a time, and it's explored more in the other accounts. This is a very dark, evil time in the nation of Egypt, okay? This is, the Hebrew midwives have been told that you are to take any newborn baby boy and kill it on the spot. That's what they were told. And when that didn't work out so well, they were told, what we want you to do is take the baby boy and throw it into the Nile, where that child will be eaten by the crocodiles. And so people will say, why on earth would Moses' parents want to bring a child into the world in that environment when they know that that child there's an edict from the Pharaoh to kill him? Why would they do that? Now, again, I'm going to tell you, they weren't afraid of the king's edict, and they went ahead and had a baby boy because they had faith. Faith in the unseen. They don't know what is going to happen. I mean, I think it's easy for Josephus to say, well, Amram had a vision. God came to him in a dream and told him that you're going to have a son, and he's going to be the deliverer of the nation of Israel. Now, could that have happened? Absolutely. That could be one of the reasons why they have faith. It could also be the kind of thing that we as people do to kind of assure ourselves that we're headed in a right direction. If Amram doesn't know what's going to happen, he thinks he may be subjecting his baby boy to being thrown in the Nile River to be eaten by crocodiles. He's got to step, I know we're supposed to have a child and we're supposed to step out in faith, and I'm not going to be afraid of the king's edict because I've got more faith over here. I mean, when you add in the equation, well, God spoke to me in a dream and told me that we're going to have a baby boy, and that baby boy is going to be the deliverer of the nation of Israel. That kind of takes the unknown out of it in terms of the equation and makes it easier. And I think that's what we as people like. We want to know what the unknown. You can tell me that it's going to be unknown to me for about 30 seconds. And then I want to know what the unknown is so that it becomes known, and then it becomes easier for me to do it. So, they're facing the fact that the midwives are supposed to murder all the male children, and that didn't work. So then, when the male children are born, they're to be thrown into the Nile to be eaten by the crocodiles. That'll make it easier on the midwives to obey. They're not actually killing them themselves. They're just throwing them into the river, and they can maybe convince themselves that maybe they'll make it, maybe they won't, but the reality is the child's going to be eaten by crocodiles. You get to the same place. The child is killed. And we see all of that in Exodus 1, verses 15 through 22, at least about the crocodiles. So despite all of this, Moses is conceived. And it's not based on his faith. It's based on his parents' faith. And when they're talking about the child was beautiful, I don't think they're talking about physical appearance. They do know that it's a special child. There's something special about him. But I think if we're honest, all of us, when we look at our children, know that there's something special about them. Because there is something special about them. There's a unique design and a purpose for each child. So, they come up with a plan as a result of their faith. They hid Moses for 3 months. And then when that wasn't going to work anymore, they took a papyrus basket, coated it with pitch, put their baby boy in the basket, and then placed the baskets in the reeds where Pharaoh's daughter bathed. Probably a pretty good idea. And this is one of the things where my mind works. If I was going to put a baby in a basket, I would probably put the basket where Pharaoh's daughter bathes. Because there's probably people keeping the crocodiles away from where Pharaoh's daughter bathes. So if you're going to put the baby in the Nile any place, right where the Pharaoh's daughter bathes is probably a pretty good spot. And to top it off, they sent Moses' big sister Miriam over to watch the whole process. So Pharaoh's daughter immediately takes Moses as her own, and up pops Miriam. And Miriam comes up with a great idea for Pharaoh's daughter. Why don't you have a surrogate from the Hebrews to care for and nurse this baby boy? Which meant that Jochebed, his mother, got paid to nurse her own baby and raise him during the formative years. But I think there is a lesson for us here that is bigger than just the fact that Moses' life was preserved by the faith of his parents. Because I think every person here, whether you're a parent or not a parent, whether you're dealing with your children, whether you're raising nieces and nephews, dealing with Camp Hope, ballet, the kids in our community and those kinds of things, there is an awesome responsibility that we have to speak into the lives of these children. And it is tough, because we are in a culture, in a world, where we want them to look at TikTok. Not we want them to. The world wants them to look at TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and X and Twitter and Snap. And I know nothing about the majority of those things other than I hear about them. Where people's attitudes, their minds, their views on the world are shaped. And this stuff is literally being driven down their throat by a culture that is anti-anything productive and good. Now that's a harsh statement, but I will own it because I believe it to be true. I don't think, if you look at the hysteria in our world now about how it's all going to blow apart and everything's going to go wrong and it's terrible. Even when my daughter's 32, I still have a responsibility to be calming her, speaking into her life, making sure she's looking at it. Sometimes this leads to some conflict, where I say, you need to look at this through a lens that's real. And I'm getting better about being very gentle about that and very logical about that and not say, no, you're wrong. Because I can't say, no, you're wrong. But when you look at the role that parents play, aunts and uncles play, people in a community play, people in the neighborhood play, if you look at the role there, you see that it is an awesome, incredible responsibility. And what will be our response to that responsibility? Will we let culture raise our children and the children around us? Or will we speak into their lives boldly, saying, this is what we need to do. This is what I want you to know. This is what I want you to be. This is how I want you to grow up. It's important. Do we have that kind of faith? The deliverance of Israel effectively began with a slave couple who believed in God in the midst of the oppression and darkness that was all around them. Based on what they see with their eyes is baby boys the edict is that baby boys be killed at the moment they're born. And if that doesn't work out, the next edict is throw them in the river where the crocodiles are going to eat them. In their mind, in their eyes, what they're seeing physically, they're seeing baby boys be killed. And yet they step out in faith based on what they can't see, but rather on where God's promises are. Do we have that kind of faith? Then we jump forward roughly 40 years to the second by faith in verses 24 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated by the people of God with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered reproach of Christ of greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. But being called the son of Pharaoh's daughter meant something. It meant he was royalty, with all that went along with that designation. That kind of wealth, power, and opportunity to focus on pleasure can and is intoxicating. But Moses, in faith, rejected it. The faith of Moses is not just incredible. What the author is showing us here is it's countercultural. His faith leads him to reject a title and position that would have put him at the top of what was then the world's leading empire. And in rejecting that title, he runs the significant risk of really offending the Pharaoh, which could be deadly. Moses stepped out in faith, and his faith was courageous. True faith will not go along to get along. True faith will take the harder path rather than compromise. Too many believers are in love with the culture around us, and as a result, we identify with a culture rather than Jesus Christ. True faith involves self-sacrifice and surrender. I really like, there's an African-American pastor by the name of Eric Mason, and I absolutely loved what he had to say. He said, self-sacrifice is entry-level Christianity. Think about that. We love to think about all the things that we've given up, if we really have given them up. Or at least all the things we like to think that we've given up. But if that kind of self-sacrifice, that kind of self-surrender truly is entry-level Christianity, and I believe that it is, I don't think we can hang on to everything that the world holds dear and move into what God has for us. So if we're going to walk with Jesus, if we're going to surrender our life to him, then we have to be ready to surrender everything else to him as well. Pastor Steve Shell told me one time, when we were talking about missionaries, and I actually said to him, I said, the last thing I want to do is go to some grass hut in equatorial Africa and be a missionary. And he goes, you better be careful with that. Because if you're going to stomp up and down and talk about what you ain't going to do, that might be exactly what he calls you to do. Are you willing to surrender the way you feel for Jesus? Are you willing to do what he wants you to do, where he wants you to do it, how he wants you to do it, when he wants you to do it? Or do you just want to live this life in this culture? Moses chose to be mistreated along with God's people. And that's an important phrase, God's people. It's used here for a reason. It's not about, it's God's people. They're his people. Rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin, he had easy and open access to. If he had remained part of Pharaoh's household, his only option would have been the ultimate rejection of God. He would have had to abandon the truth. There comes a point, if you're going to live that kind of life, where you're given over to culture and to the pleasures of the moment, to stuff, there's going to come a point where you gotta choose. Again, I don't quote Bob Dylan as some type of spiritual expert. But as he says in the lyric to one of his songs, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're gonna serve somebody. And if you're gonna serve somebody, please, let's serve Jesus. And let's surrender to him in every possible way and not get wound up with what the world has. So how was he able to do that? What gives Moses the strength to do that? We see it in verse 26. He considered the reproach of Christ, that's disgrace for the sake of Christ, greater wealth than the treasure of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Jesus had always been one with his people. The prophet Isaiah says it in Isaiah 63:9. In all their distress, he too was distressed. He's talking about the Jewish people. And in their distress, the Jewish people, Jesus was distressed. When Moses chooses the disgrace of the Jewish people, he is ultimately identifying with Christ. And he was able to endure, for he was looking to the reward. Now, is the author saying that Moses specifically knew of a Jesus, that he knew that name, that it was fixed in his mind? No. He knows of the prophecy of the coming Messiah. He knows there will be the ultimate deliverer who will come. All the prophecy is pointing into one direction. And he knows that's what's out on the horizon. That's the truth that he can't see with his eyes right now, but that is coming. So he knows that there is going to be someone who will save mankind from itself. The point here is that the prophetic message of the Old Testament is completed in Jesus. Everything written in the Old Testament finds its ultimate meaning in the person of Jesus Christ, the Messiah who was promised to Israel. The author is pointing us, and we're going to say it again, to the basic foundation of faith that he lays out in verse 1. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The Apostle Paul said in Romans 8:18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us." He goes on in Romans 8:28, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." And he gives the same message in an effort to encourage the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. You believe it before you see it. I mean, one of the things that was super interesting to me, I heard an interview of a man who, during the Vietnam conflict, had been a POW. He'd been a prisoner of the North Vietnamese for years, and under horrific conditions. And they asked him, "How did you make it?" And he said, "I didn't fall into the trap of believing that I was going to be out by Christmas." He said, "Because I heard guys talking about that. I had heard they'd say, I'm going to be out by Christmas. I'm going to be out by this date. I'm going to be out by that date. I'm going to be released soon." And they'd hang on to it. Then that date would come and they'd get discouraged. And then they would get even more discouraged when the next day came. And finally, they just gave up. They gave up emotionally. They gave up physically. He said, "I always knew that there would come a point when I would be released. I didn't know when it was going to be. I didn't know how it was going to be accomplished. But I knew the point would come when I would no longer be in the custody of the North Vietnamese." They asked him how he knew that. And he said, "Because my Jesus told me so." Now, he's not talking about Jesus appearing to him or anything like that. He's trusting that God will deliver him for this situation. Doesn't know where, doesn't know how, doesn't know when. He just knows it will happen. And it was that faith that allowed him to endure. He was able to believe it before he was able to see it. How many times have we balked at taking a step of faith because we don't trust what we can't see? But that is exactly what Moses did. He trusted God, and we are called to do the very same kind of thing. Verse 27, "By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." The author is talking about Moses' 40-year time away from Egypt and Midian, a separation that was the result of faith in what he could not see. Verse 28, "By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them." It took 10 plagues to convince Pharaoh to let Moses' people go. And the 10th plague was the one that sealed the deal, the destruction of all male firstborn of both man and animal, Exodus 12:12. God provided a very specific way of salvation for his people. They were directed via Moses to kill a lamb, take some hyssop and dip it in the lamb's blood, and put some of the blood on the top and the sides of the doorways of their homes. And homes anointed in this way would fall under God's protection, with the destroyer being prevented from entering. Exodus chapter 12, verses 21 through 23. Very specific instructions from God that were to be obeyed to the letter. Instructions that were a foreshadow of the ultimate sacrifice of the perfect Lamb of God, Jesus. The phrase, by faith he kept the Passover, actually means that Moses instituted the Passover, started it. And it was instituted as a lasting ordinance, something to be done every year in remembrance. Moses never doubted God, and he never doubted that God's people would be delivered from Egypt. And it was Moses' faith that saved and delivered Israel. Now we turn to the final by faith, verse 29. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. Okay, now this is one of those areas where the author really has to be talking about kind of the end game, kind of the end of things. Because we also have to look at this in light of Moses' faith. Because were the people of Israel chomping at the bit to go across? Is that what they were doing? Well, we see in Exodus 14, 11 through 12, they said to Moses, "It is because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness. What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Does that sound like a group of folks that are full of faith, that are just can't wait to cross the Red Sea? Ultimately, they did cross the Red Sea. Ultimately, they did accept what Moses was telling them. They followed his direction, and they crossed in faith. But it took them a while to get there. And it's ultimately that same lack of faith that will result in all of them dying in the wilderness, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. It was Moses' faith that led to their deliverance. I want you to think about this. The faith of one man led to the deliverance of the nation. How might your faith transform the world around us? What might happen? What might happen if one person decides that they're going to step out in faith, trusting God to make a difference in the world, in whatever way that they're called to do that? You could list hundreds of things that someone might do. Now, there's a difference sometimes between stepping out in faith and doing things and just trying to do them on your own. That's very clear. And listen, I will raise my hand that I can get out ahead of God faster, or at least as fast as anybody else. And one of the questions I've been asking myself the past few months is, am I hearing from God, or am I telling God what I want to do? Is the idea I have from God, or is it from me? And I'm trying to convince God it's a good idea. Now we have to be mindful of that. We have to be discerning. And how we do that is by being in God's Word and being in prayer and seeking Him constantly over what He has for us to do. But when we believe that we are called to do a specific thing in a specific way at a specific time, you can be part of changing the world, even if it's in a small way. Because changing the world in a small way is how the world gets changed in really big ways. Genuine faith can transform and deliver families, churches, communities, the marketplace, and the world. The church that the preacher is addressing was experiencing their own form of Egypt or exile. They were being oppressed by both the Romans and their fellow Jews. The only thing that was going to allow them to endure to the end was a genuine belief in God's Word and the promise for the future. And to do that, they had to have a faith to see what was unseen. The author is using Moses and his preference for suffering over the momentary pleasures of the world as a role model for that persecuted church and for us. Moses is a type or foreshadowing of the ultimate role model, Jesus, who willingly went to the cross on our behalf. Our culture is becoming increasingly hostile to biblical faith. I know that there are many people, and I've talked to a lot of them, that believe that after the most recent political cycle, things were all good. Things were good. It's going to be easy for a while. Guess again. I think that if you are a believing person, you are going to face an increasingly hostile world in terms of biblical faith. I think that day is coming, and I think it's coming swiftly. And I think there's a time coming when Christians will be persecuted openly for their faith. And the question will come, how will we respond? I mean, one of the things that I want to do is I want to have anybody who wants to come along go through a book with me that is called The Trellis and the Vine. It is all about ministry and how churches do ministry. And the trellis is the structure and the vine is what takes off. And what's the interplay between structure and ministry and all of those kinds of things. And more to come on that. So, but that's something that I would like us to kind of just have a sit down about and just talk. Not a formal Bible study, but going through the book together and seeing where we're going to go. But how are we going to respond? And I think we have to get ready. That's why I want to do things like that. The only way that we are going to persevere, the only way that we are going to do what God calls us to do, which is to take territory for Him, is to have faith. A faith that believes in the promises of God and sees the unseen. I really do believe that faith, genuine faith, has to be faith. Has to be all about. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction or the certainty of things not seen. And I think that's what God calls us to. Lord, I thank you for today. I thank you for your word. I thank you for the book of Hebrews. I thank you for the examples of faith that you've given to us in the book of Hebrews. Help us to have a faith that sees the unseen and steps out boldly in a world that desperately needs to know you. Be with us, guide us, give us strength, encourage us, equip us, and enable us to be your hands and feet in this world. And I pray these things in your name, Lord.